I'm Aaron Maté with the Grayzone. In the aftermath of the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, what is next for the war in Ukraine? Well, joining me is someone with firsthand insight on that conflict. Benoit Paré is a former official in the French Defense Ministry and the European Union, and he spent years on the ground in Ukraine as an observer with the OSCE. That's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He recounts that experience in his new book. It's called What I Saw in Ukraine, 2015 to 2022, Diary of an International Observer. Benoit Paré, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for your invitation.
Okay, let's get to Ukraine. The standard picture from the period that you're there, you're on the ground in Ukraine from 2015 to 2022. The standard picture is that so after you have the Maidan revolution, coup, depending how you see it, in 2014, where the government of Yanukovych was overthrown with U.S. support, you had a civil war break out between the US-backed new government in Kyiv and the Russian-backed rebels in the east who revolted against the ouster of their elected leader, Yanukovych, and the ensuing crackdown on their culture, their ethnic Russian culture in eastern Donbas. Now, so here in the U.S., this period is described as basically Russia launched a invasion of Ukraine by stealing Crimea, annexing Crimea, and backing the rebels in the east. You were on the ground during this period. What do you think is most important for people to know?
Well, there's so many things that I saw. That's why I wrote a whole book about it. But I mean, the strange things to me started from the induction course. It would be too long to mention, but that's why, as I said, I wrote the book. But from the induction course, I felt that our own organization, the OSCE, at least some people within the organization, were biased. Our mandate stipulated that we should be neutral, but we had people who were briefing us that were obviously not neutral from the very first days, and I found that strange. And then I was deployed in Donbas. And in Donbas, well, the reality that I saw pretty quickly was that the Ukrainian side was shelling mostly more than the separatist side, you could say. And then even when you talk to the local population, even those living on the government control side, they were in majority leaning towards the separatists, which was not written anywhere that I could see. I never saw any newspaper article describing this reality, but we saw it in different places that we visited, and I saw it from the first day I visited a village of Port-de-Mivka, north of Donetsk, where basically the local inhabitants were outraged because the Ukrainian military had decided to occupy the local kindergarten. And they were afraid that the separatists would basically shell their village because of the presence of the Ukrainian army. That was the first instance. And then I remember I went also in another village near another place called Orivka, north of Donetsk. And over there was a meeting organized by the local authorities with villagers. And when I arrived there, I was so shocked by the amount of rage that the people demonstrated against the Ukrainian armed forces, not against the separatists. It was literally rage. They were accusing them of all the wrong things that were happening to them. They were accusing them, of scaring the kids, of threatening people, or of looting houses, or destroying local infrastructure to build trenches, or even shelling themselves. Some people were accusing the Ukrainian military of shelling villages that they were controlling to accuse the separatists. Now, I don't have proof of that, but this is what the local people said, and some of them were on the edge of tears and shouting when they were telling these tales, and they could not stand the fact that people would doubt their testimony. It was so shocking for me to see the scene. And when I went back to the office, I remember the interpreter, local interpreter, who was very familiar with this area, asked me, "So how was it?" And I told her how it was. And he said, "Well, it's not surprising to me, because these people, they heavily lean towards the DPR, which was the Donetsk People's Republic, right? But even actually this, what I could see with my own eyes, this would not make it to report such events because it was not considered factual by the organization I was working. It was considered, okay, hearsay. Locals make accusations, but we could not confirm the accusation. So it's like they don't exist, they don't count. And so it will never appear in our reports. But such testimonies, I got so many of them. First in the Kramatorsk area north of Donetsk, but then when I was deployed to Mariupol, I got similar testimonies from local people. Now, I'm not saying that all the accusations were founded, right? But at least it would show that there was this huge defiance within the Ukrainian armed forces. And then I summed it up in an expression was that actually for them, the occupation forces were not, Russian forces or separatist forces. It was clearly the Ukrainian armed forces, And this is the impression I got from the terrain after, several years being on the ground in different places. But that would never appear in our reports because it was not considered factual.
Just to give people a sense of what it was like in the Donbas, this is the eastern region of Ukraine that rebelled against the 2014 coup. This is a rare clip from CNN, one of the few times in which I think Western media actually showed their audiences the truth of what was happening in the Donbas and the experience of people there who were living under the shelling of the Ukrainian government, as you described. So this was CNN in 2014.
Petro Poroshenko will have a hard time winning back hearts and minds in this city. As the people of Donetsk sweep up the debris of their homes and livelihoods, they are hardened against a president they say is killing his own people. We are Ukrainian, but they kill us, this man says. So we probably need our own country, because these people in Kyiv, they are not brothers for us. The shells hit these homes days ago, but the tears are still fresh.
27-го, 28-го, 29-го очень сильно. Фактически мы живем под подвалом.
We live on the ground. It was so hard for 2 weeks, especially for 27, 28, 29th. But only today it's quiet.
Извините, я пойду.
Sorry, I need to go.
2 people were killed outside this block of flats last Wednesday. One of them was a 50-year-old woman, the other a 34-year-old woman. Her husband, who won't talk to us, he says he's in shock, managed to make it down to the cellar with their little child, but she just didn't have the time. And this is a story that repeats itself over and over in dozens of apartment blocks with civilians being killed by the constant shelling around Donetsk. The city's trauma hospital is filled with the civilian wounded, shrapnel embedded in the flesh and bone of market sellers' legs, the broken limbs of pensioners far too old to run. There was one war, and this is the second war, this old lady tells me. I was born in 1940 in World War II, and I will probably die before this war is over. Valentina Popova in the next-door ward lost her leg and her arm to indiscriminate artillery shells. Switching to the Ukrainian language, she makes a heart-rending plea to the president. We used to dance, sing, do everything in Ukrainian, she says. Poroshenko, Mr. Poroshenko, please listen to us. Why don't you understand your people? Be a man, be human. Please stop your aggression. Stop this war. But there is little sign of that. This once thriving city is now half empty, its railway station bombed. The forces unleashed.
So there you go. That's CNN in 2014. And if you were to say what was said in that video now on CNN, you'd be accused of spreading Russian propaganda. But that's a glimpse of what the reality was like, and a very rare look at it from a Western outlet like CNN. Benoit.
Yeah, thank you for that. I hadn't seen this report, but I saw another one similar by CNN, actually, about Lugansk, because the city of Lugansk was shelled on 2nd of June 2014 by fighter planes, actually. It was filmed. There were images of it. And I was surprised about the fact that the CNN report was pretty honest, I have to say, right? It described the amount of casualties which correspond to the official amount of casualties declared by the Luhansk People's Republic, as I later double-checked. There's even a monument locally over there with the names of all the victims. And so in those days, you could say that CNN was reporting the truth about what was going on the ground. And the testimonies that people say in the clip, I heard similar testimonies myself when I was deployed to Golovka, which is a city north of Donetsk, which was part of the Donetsk People's Republic. And I had similar testimonies from people. And when I asked them, would you consider like joining Ukraine back again? And oftentimes the answer was that, well, too much blood has been spilled. And they said, how can we join back a country that considers us as terrorists and that decides to kill us, right? So how can we want to go back to that country? So I heard these statements, but again, it was not considered factual. It was not considered something important for our reports. So it never reached our hierarchy in Kyiv. But also, after a while, you realize that, anyways, there were some things that people in our hierarchy didn't want to hear, anyways, right? Because people higher up didn't want to hear it. And once it was a colleague of mine who actually reported to me a discussion he had with the US ambassador who was then visiting. And at some point, the US ambassador, we had dinner in some place, and US ambassador asked them to describe. I think the question was like, do you have any human rights violation to report? And my colleague at that time, he only had examples of human rights violations by Ukrainian armed forces. And including in those days, I mean, we knew of, in Kramatorsk area, we knew of basically people disappearing like every second day. They were usually kidnapped by the voluntary battalions or by the SBU. And they would pop up, after a few days, and you would discover that they would be officially arrested. In the meantime, they had been locked up in some basement, beaten up until they would sign blank papers. And once they signed the blank paper, they would be released and then arrested officially. And then with these signed confessions, right? This was the kind of story my colleagues collected in those days. So he was starting to mention that. And the US ambassador said, well, sorry, I'm not interested. And next. And then he asked somebody else to speak. And my colleague was that speechless. What? He does not care. Right? So that doesn't serve a narrative, basically. So, yeah, that was the situation.
We've talked a bit about these far right forces, right sector and others that were increasingly powerful in the aftermath of the Maidan coup. The Azov battalion, a neo-Nazi paramilitary, was on the front lines of the Ukrainian government's fight against the Donbas rebels. What did you observe about the role of these neo-Nazi, ultra-nationalist, whatever you want to call them, forces that were fighting in the Donbas?
What I mostly learned about them when I was deployed to Mariupol, because after the initial induction in Kiev and then Donetsk, where I spent 2 weeks, I spent 1 year in Kramatorsk, and then I spent more than 2 years in Mariupol. And Mariupol is the home base of Azov. So it is there that I ended up learning a lot of information, compromising information about Azov. And very, very quickly, I could discover the inside of a position that was held by the Azov battalion west of Shirokine. Shirokine was a village east from Mariupol, where there was an ongoing battle for more than a year, from 2014 to 2015. And Azov battalion was the spearhead of the Ukrainian armed forces in that location. And once they when the separatist forces withdrew from the village because they considered it was undefendable and they were tired of being constantly shelled, they withdrew from the village, and there was an agreement which stipulated that the village should remain unoccupied by any armed forces, but Azov did not respect it, and they took over the village. And once they took over the village, actually, they basically withdrew from the positions further west. So we, the OSCE, at that moment, decided to occupy these positions further west because it was on a hill, which was basically had an overview on the valley below. So it was an excellent observation point. So that's why we decided to occupy it. And when we actually went there, we discovered the buildings occupied by Azov, they had basically painted swastikas all over the place. I counted 5 or 6, including a drawn portrait of Adolf Hitler in a car. I mean, there are pictures in my book, right? Because I thought this is amazing. And I took pictures to document these things. To make sure that nobody would say that I was like inventing stuff. And anyway, everybody in the Mariupol base knew about these things because we would, oftentimes go to this base. And then later on, I discovered another former small base of Azov battalion, and at the entrance there was one wall remaining. There was a huge swastikas painted on it, right? And when I asked one local guy who was like digging in the dirt over there because they had left and the place in disarray, and he confirmed he was the owner of the place, and he confirmed it was Azov that was there just before. And in those days, when you would do research online, you would find videos of Azov soldiers parading with Nazi flags in their own bases. And in one of those videos, you clearly see a guy who stands on the balcony of the 2-floor building, and below you have a group of his supporters, all wearing their uniform, and they are cheering him up, and this guy is basically waving a huge Nazi flag. Nazi flag is like 2 meters wide or something. And I perfectly recognize the building where this was filmed. And the building was basically in a location occupied by Azov in Yurivka. It's a village west of Mariupol. So, there was no doubt this is again the famous Mariupol battalion. But it's not the worst thing. Our base was also following another base, but the mission, the OSCE mission, was following trials which were conflict related, right? And that's a phenomenon that was totally ignored by the media, even the Ukrainian media, national media at least. And in these trials, there were 2 types of trials. There were trials against alleged separatists. Usually it was against people who had hardly done anything serious. They were just making phone calls, commenting about movements of armed forces, sometimes maybe with the idea to actually report to somebody on the DPR side about the movements of the Ukrainian armed forces. But other times it really appeared as just conversation between friends about what was going on in the village. But anyways, they would all be arrested, all be sentenced, no matter what. And so this was one type of trials. And then the other type of trial was about some members of these volunteer battalions who had gone way over the top. And several of these trials involved Azov members. Others involved members of the Donbas battalion, which was another voluntary battalion created just in the aftermath of the launch of what they call the anti-terrorist operation, ATO, that was launched by the Ukrainian government back in April 2014. Yeah. And I heard testimonies about atrocities committed by these battalions. Also, Dnipro 1 battalion was one of those. Aidar battalion was another one.
Yeah.
And Aidar battalion, I got testimonies about the killings they did against civilians. I got testimony from a priest in the Lugansk area who was terrified by them, terrified by what he saw, and he thought he would never survive. And among all the people I've interviewed in my life, and I've interviewed quite a few, this was maybe the most terrified person I ever talked to, this priest. And the priest is supposed to be like a man of God, a man who's supposed to portray, a minimum of self-insurance so that he can basically reassure people who come to him for advice or for counsel. And this guy who's supposed to counsel and advise others, was himself terrified. I was really impressed by that. I was really impressed. And when you see that people like him were terrified, I mean, where do the local people could actually, to whom could they go to find solace? You know, then you realize the trauma that many people went through during such conflict. Like going back to these guys from Azov, what we discovered from some of the trials, and again, some of it was like, documented in court. Other stories were mentioned in the local media in Mariupol area. But let's say if we just focus on the things that ended up in court, we learned that many of them committed murders, sometimes murders following tortures, kidnapping and torture. And they basically were thinking that they could do whatever they wanted. And one of these guys accused of torture and murder was basically a member of a small group within the Azov battalion, which called themselves the SS Bears, as I recall. SS Bears. And it was a small unit that was occupying a small village east of Mariupol. And I found a picture of these guys, and with the name of one of the members whose trial we followed, and his name was Mortika. And on this picture, you have a group of about 12 Azov soldiers. They all gather around a portrait of Adolf Hitler, literally, right? The SS Wolves. Bears, sorry. SS Wolves or Bears? Well, I have a little doubt about the exact name, but specifically remember SS. But who knows about these people now? You even have people who say, oh, this is like Russian propaganda, or, it's not representative, whatever. But then actually I talked to a member of the Azov security team. I was allowed to visit one of the bases of Azov in Mariupol city, in Mariupol East. It was a company level base. And the security officer, even before I asked, told me, well, if you ask us if we still have Nazis here, and it was 2018 when I visited. He said, oh yeah, we still have Nazis in our ranks. He admitted it. But he said, oh, we just got rid of the craziest ones, and we asked the others to be more discreet. That's it, right? And this is, again, first-hand testimony from a guy within Azov.
Yeah.
So, I had no doubt that this guy was still there, but okay, they were just asked to be more discreet. And also, from 2015, there was a law passed by the Ukrainian parliament, which I mentioned in my book, which basically, it was a law that was primarily meant to forbid signs of communism, right? So then, throughout Ukraine, they started to dismantle statues of Lenin. They started to even change the names of every village, every single street that was linked to the history of the USSR. They changed everything, but also within the same law, they actually wrote an article about the fact that symbolism of Nazism would be forbidden as well. Right? So maybe they did that because Western governments maybe advised them to do so, because the fact that Azov was portraying a Nazi symbol was already well known back in 2015. So I guess Western powers who were supporting the new authorities probably advised them, please delete these Nazi symbols, because it doesn't help us to sell the narrative of the freedom fighters of Ukraine that defend democracy against the Russian barbarians. So anyways, then they so the amount of Nazi symbols you could see was not as was lower, let's say, not as, you wouldn't see as many symbols as you would see before. But once Russia launched its special major operation in 2022, if you looked carefully at Telegram channels, you could see that the discrete Nazi symbols starting to appear again on the uniforms of the Ukrainian armed forces. but they were not as obvious as the swastikas, because swastikas is too obvious. So they would use other means like the black sun and other symbols that the name of which I don't remember as of now. But some of the symbols I didn't even know myself were associated to Nazism before I went to Ukraine. And I just found it later on when I was exposed to them and when I read about them. And
Yes,
so
and
it
it's my
was a way
understanding,
to show, sorry?
and it's also my understanding that they renamed streets after Nazi collaborators.
Yeah, also, I mean, from what I read, also, like, I mean, they started to call streets after Bandera, which was pretty common in Western Ukraine, but also streets about even like people you could consider real war criminals who are known to have ordered or participated in major war crimes in 1943.
On the issue of these ultra-nationalist neo-Nazi battalions, it's my understanding that one of the reasons why the Ukrainian government relied on them so much, on top of the fact that they were very instrumental in the Maidan coup 2014, is that there were actually a lot of defections from the Ukrainian army, people who didn't want to fight the people of the Donbas. Did you observe that? People in the Ukrainian military abandoning their posts because they didn't want to fight the Russian-backed rebels in the east?
I wouldn't say that I personally, from my first-hand experience, actually encountered such cases. But, you could clearly see that there were two different kinds of soldiers. There were the real nationalist soldiers for whom, there were no peace talks to be held. They were basically standing for fight till death, no matter what. And the problem is that these people are in power right now in Ukraine, anyways. And then you have people from the regular military. Now, I heard stories about the shape of the initial Ukrainian military back in 2014, and I heard that some of the soldiers were not very motivated to fight, and actually many of them actually joined the separatists.
Yeah.
I found these statistics from the Ukrainian government back in September 2015. They had counted 8,000 police and military members who actually joined the separatist forces in Donbas. 8,000. So, it's not a small number. And I met at least one of them, an officer who told me he used to be within the Ukrainian armed forces and that he decided to join the DPR militia. And this guy was from Mariupol. And he told me all his family was in Mariupol. And that when he made his decision, basically he got separated from his family. And I also met another guy who actually he was not a member of the armed forces initially, but he was from Kramatorsk. And when the separatist forces withdrew from Kramatorsk, when he followed them, and then he basically got separated from his family until now, you could say. So some of these people had tragic stories because of the war, they had to make a choice between the ideal of a future for their own country and the having a happy family life, and they had to sacrifice it for many of them. Now, also, what I found out when I was in Mariupol, not talking about the military, but talking about the police, which was very interesting, because many people to whom I talked, they said something strange happened in the Donbas in 2014 because. Like in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, for instance, you had a small group of 15 guys, commando led by this Russian guy, Igor Strelkov, Akat Gurkin. He actually, with a commando of 15 people, he took over the municipality of Slavyansk and the municipality of Kramatorsk, both of which gather maybe 350,000 people, right? 350,000 people, sorry. And a journalist told me, how come 15 guys could take over such a municipality as big as Kramatorsk, which had 600 police officers present? Where were they? And I had a part of the explanation about that when I went to Mariupol later on, because then I talked to the guy who was the secretary of the municipal council. So it was like the number 2 of the municipality back then. And the guy told me, well, the police that we had in Mariupol, And one specific unit called the 3057 unit, which was like the riot police. So that unit was sent to Maidan, because in Maidan, during the 2 or 3 months that during which the protests were going on, and they called the riot police units from all over the country to basically relay each other on the square, because it was quite tough for them. They were basically a lot of stuff was thrown at them, Molotov cocktails, sometimes real bullets, whatever people could find, stones, chains, and many of them got wounded. It was very tough for them, and they were not allowed to shoot back, and the guy from municipality was telling me many of them were traumatized coming back from this Maidan events. And then he said they were even more traumatized when they saw that at some point the whole thing degenerates, and that there's chaos and confusion, and then all of a sudden the riot police, who was supposed to protect the state, they stand as the accused of basically returning against the people, right? And then these people thought, okay, we were just doing our duty, following orders, and all of a sudden, for doing just exactly that, we could end up having our hands tied in our back and having to kneel on a stage in front of thousands of people who would spit at us and insult us for betraying the Ukrainian people. So where is the legitimate power? So the politician was explaining to me, you have to put yourself in their shoes. So these people didn't know where legitimacy was anymore. So first there's a coup in Maidan, and then there's a counter coup in Mariupol. Because in Mariupol, basically, you had big part of the population that was very much against what happened in Maidan, and they supported a separatist government. And for a while, it was not clear who was controlling the city. The municipal team was like trying to basically indulge all sides without getting too much involved, and the police was doing the same. The local police didn't really take sides, and so this is how it was explained to me why they didn't take side. But then for the nationalists, the fact that the local police would not choose a side was a proof of their betrayal.
Right.
Because for the nationalists, people of Azov, there was no such thing as not being on the side of a new government. If you were not clearly on the side of the government, you were a traitor, right? So pretty quickly, also the Azov nationalists turned against leaders of the local police, and the leader of the local police it's a long story what happened in Mariupol. I talked to it extensively in my book because it's very interesting to understand the dynamics of what happened in the aftermath of the Maidan events and the power games that took place in a city where many actors didn't really know how to position themselves.
Right.
It's very interesting to understand from the inside the dynamics of such movement. But in the end, after a major violent event on 9th of May in Mariupol, where the police station was attacked.
9th of May, 2014.
It was 9th of May 2014, yeah. The police station was attacked, and then the crowd got involved, and there was a lot of confusion because it was not clear at that moment who attacked the police station. And the local population tend to side with the local police because they saw the local police on their side. Right? But then it was the armed forces, including Azov and the National Guard, that intervened, and people thought they were intervening to basically turn against the local police. But the real story is a bit more complicated than that. And when you dig into it, you realize that the local police itself was divided.
Right.
And they had a new boss who had been designated from Kyiv. After basically dismissing 2 heads of local police in Mariupol, the new government decided that they needed to have their guy in Mariupol to take control back. So they actually found this guy who was not from Donbas. That this guy quickly found himself in direct conflict with his subordinates. And that ended up in this attack of the police station. And my interpretation of the event is that most probably the separatists wanted to get rid of a new head of police, and if possible, of all the heads of the government battalions that had deployed around the city, and that were convoked that day by the new head of police. But somehow this attempted takeover of the police building failed. The building was burned down.
Yeah.
Then there was confusion and chaos, but at least the objective that was reached by the separatists was that the battalions that were basically on the side of the government, they could not interfere in the referendum that took place 2 days afterwards. I think the really important thing was that on 11th of May 2014, you had this Donbas-wide referendum organized by the separatists for independence, right?
Yeah.
And I think the head of police, designated by Kyiv, had tried to organize a system to prevent this referendum from taking place. But the attack of the police station prevented that from happening, and then all the battalions favorable to the government didn't dare to interfere because there was a rebellion of the population against them. When you look at the images of this, what happened in this day, it was pretty clear the local population stood on the side of the separatists on that day. The videos that are available online of events are quite remarkable. At some point, you see some guys who stand alone in the street against a column of armored vehicles. It was reminiscent of these famous images of China when they had this attempted revolution in 1989, if you remember that. It was the events of I forgot the name of the main square.
Tiananmen Square.
Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
The Tiananmen Square event. You remember these images of one guy, a civilian alone, standing in front of the column of tanks. So it was for the entire West look like the courage of the lone civilian against the power of a totalitarian state. The guy standing up in front of a totalitarian state. And you have images of what happened in Mariupol, very reminiscent of that. But
Right.
they didn't go around the world like the images of Tiananmen. They were kept hidden.
And this gets to my next question. The narrative that we have here in the West is that the Donbas uprising, the rebels, it was all just Russian. That this was a Russian invasion. This was not an organic grassroots uprising, and there were Russian military officials that were embedded inside the rebellion, so they can point to that as evidence of that this is being just all controlled from Moscow. Having been on the ground, what's your understanding of the nature of the organic nature of the Donbas uprising and the extent of Russian control over it?
Well, it is true that there were some Russians involved in the events. Now, I mentioned one of them, Igor Strelkov, right? But he himself says that he was not sent by the Russian government, that he said he was sent by the president of Crimea. And his godfather, so to speak, is actually a Eurasian businessman who is a monarchist. And the same businessman actually also is also somebody who apparently was instrumental in promoting another Russian in Donbas. And this other Russian, whose name I don't remember right now, but was at some point nominated prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic from 14th of May 2014, as I recall. But now, of course, some people would claim that the fact that these two people were nominated in rather high-level positions in the DPR structure was proof of Russian support for the separatists. But indeed, you cannot argue against facts, and these people indeed had positions of power. How much direct control there was from the Russian government on them, I'm not entirely sure about that. For sure, you could claim that they were in touch with this Russian businessman. Was this Russian businessman also used by the Russian authorities to actually basically implement their plans? Maybe so, but I don't have proof of that. We can just speculate about that. But when you study what happened in Mariupol, again, this is a case study for me, which I heavily studied. And you don't see in Mariupol, when you actually look at the background of all the people involved, all the main actors of the local political and military scene, none of them is Russian. Even the people who were involved in the attack, allegedly involved in the attack of the police station, all of them were natives from Mariupol, even according to Mirot Dvorets. And Mirot Dvorets, it's this Ukrainian nationalist site that basically lists all the enemies of Ukraine, right? And they have a page.
I'm on that list. Yeah,
I guess I will be on that list soon if I'm not there already.
I think that's a fair bet. Yes.
Anyways, but when I used their own sources, right? I looked at the page that dedicated to the attack of a Mariupol police station, and all the suspects they list, they also give their names and their address, and they address all in Mariupol. They are all inhabitants of Mariupol, and then but they are represented as Russian terrorists.
Right.
What Russian terrorists? They are born in Mariupol. Yeah. Anyways, even after that, I saw other cases where basically other people whom I knew from first-hand witnesses were local inhabitants and that died at some point. And in the press, they were presented as Russian terrorists. I mentioned such a story from a village that I was visiting near Kramatorsk. And I talked to the daughter of one of these guys who died by walking on a booby trap, and he was presenting in the Ukrainian media as a Russian terrorist. And he said, "This is my father. This is our village. We've always been living here. So what kind of Russian terrorist my father is?" Right? On top of it, during this interview, she claimed that this information came from an OSCE report, which was another complete bullshit because the organization would never say anything like that for various reasons. So it's also an example of media manipulation in those days, and it was everywhere you looked.
Got it. Let's get to the Minsk Accords. You come in around the time of the second Minsk Accords in February 2015, and this is the agreement between Kyiv, the government in Ukraine, and the Russian-backed rebels in the east to end the war. And there's a series of steps. It's called the package of measures. And there's a lot of still debate over who is responsible for the failure of Minsk. This is signed back in February 2015, and obviously Minsk was a failure because we had a Russian invasion in February 2022. So to you, I mean, Minsk is confusing for many people because there's very many steps. There's confusion about, who should take what step first. What do you is most important to know about the Minsk Accords, and who do you fault for the fact that they were not successful?
Okay, I'll be very clear. For me, the fault lies on Ukraine, primarily, by far. The Minsk agreements, because there are several agreements, started on September 5th, 2014. Then there was another protocol signed on the 19th of September still. And then there was what we call Minsk II, signed on February 12th, 2015. And that's the most precise agreement of all the agreements. And it has 13 points. Now, these 13 points are quite clear on some aspects. And it was very clear that the political the articles related to the political settlement of the conflict were entirely up to Ukraine to adopt, right? And if you don't solve the political issue, which is at the root of the conflict, then you cannot solve anything, right? Then as long as you have a reason for people to continue fighting, then you will have ceasefire violations, and then you will have violations of the withdrawal of weapons because people could not get what they wanted by peaceful means. And in any case, so everything revolved on the fact that Donbas, the territory is controlled by the separatists, was supposed to have a status, an autonomy status. It was not even independence. It was an autonomy within Ukraine. And for that to happen, the Ukrainian parliament had to adopt two different laws. One law was supposed to create the specific status of autonomy for these Donbas regions. And the second law was supposed to be a change to the constitution that would enable the first law to be valid, right? They needed to change their constitution, in other terms, to create an autonomy status for Donbas. The issue was that for both these laws, the majority in parliament differs. If you want to adopt just the law of autonomy for Donbas, you just needed a 50% plus one majority vote for it to be adopted. But when you consider changing the constitution, you needed a 2/3 majority, right? So a higher majority to be adopted. Now, on the day the Ukrainian parliament was supposed to vote on this text, it was 31st of August 2015. And the whole Minsk agreement was supposed to be finished by 31st of December 2015, right? So there was a timetable. What happened that day? Around the parliament, you had a massive crowd of about tens of thousands of nationalist demonstrators who were strongly against any concession to the separatists. And there was a police cordon around the parliament. I remember seeing the images of all of this at that time. Now it's hard to find. I made a research for the purpose of my book about all these things, and it's harder today to find information about what happened, which is amazing. Even on Wikipedia, it's totally absent. Nothing about this aspect is mentioned on Wikipedia, either in English or even in French. It's totally deleted when it was the most important aspect of a Minsk agreement. But if you delete it, then you delete the fact that Ukraine was responsible for its failure, right? There's a logic of deleting the information. But anyways, going back to what happened, when the crowd learned that the parliament had voted the first text of law, there was one of the nationalists threw a hand grenade on the police cordon. And there were like 3 policemen dead, 1 journalist killed, 4 people dead, dozens wounded. And it was a big event. And then you had 3 different political parties, Ukrainian political parties, represented in parliament. One of them was Yulia Tymoshenko's party. And they all stated that they would never vote for a change of a constitution that would allow an autonomy status for Donbas, right? And from that moment, I understood the Minsk agreement is dead, right? It's pretty clear because that's at the root of everything. If you don't solve the root cause of the problem. So the only way you could actually hope for the Minsk agreement to be applied was if there was a change of majority in parliament. But in those days, you had to wait until 2019. So meaning that between 2015 to 2019, nothing moved. You had ceasefire violations, regularly. And the Ukrainian authorities would regularly accuse the separatists of being responsible for violations of the ceasefire. But actually, when you looked deeper into the data that we had, you can conclude, especially later on when we did statistics, as I did, about the damages to properties. 75% of the shelling in the Luhansk Oblast, for instance, 75% of the damage to property due to shelling was on the separatist side, meaning caused by Ukrainian armed forces, 75%. And when you actually looked at the figures of civilian casualties due to the continuation of the acts of war, which is shelling and shooting, the figure was very similar between 2016 and 18. And again, I did myself statistics because I had all the data available. Very few people within my organization had this data. And then I realized it was super interesting. So I started to do the statistics that my own mission wouldn't do. And I discovered that 72% of the victims of shelling and shooting were on the separatist side, meaning caused by the Ukrainian armed forces. Right. So if you compare both statistics, victims and damages to property, we had very similar percentages that matched, which were 2 tangible criteria to conclude that during all this time, all these periods, it was the Ukrainian armed forces who were shelling the most by far. Right.
This data that you collected, did this come up publicly from the OSCE? Were you allowed to release this?
There was only a small part of it that came out because in 2016, our organization, people in our organization decided to do a systematic verification of all the allegations of civilian victims. of the conflict, but starting from 1st January 2016. We didn't do that verification for the years before. Anyways, but from that moment, we started to do it. And then once the year 2016 was over, my colleagues in the head office, they collected all the data that we had collectively gathered from the field, and I was part of that. And they made a report. It was a pretty long report. And they tried to analyze the data under various angles. And the most interesting, actually, information was on page 7, as I recall, in this document. It was not even on the front page. It was on page 7. And that was the only time when the OSCE actually displayed the statistics that showed there were more victims on the separatist side than on the government control side. But even if they had mixed together victims of mines and unexplosive UXOs, unexplosive ordnances, together with victims of shelling, they mixed the two together, and the figure that came out was that 63% of victims were on the separatist side. But again, if you only consider the acts of war, it's 72, right? Anyways, even with just that one statistics, the Ukrainian government was furious when it came out. And it accused my organization, the OSCE, of basically having been misled by Russian observers who would have basically falsified the data, which was a ridiculous claim. I mean, for me, having been involved in the process, I can tell you there was not a single Russian that I know that was involved in this process of first collecting the information on the ground and analyzing it afterwards. There was not a single Russian citizen who was actually in a position of power within the organization. So the highest position they had was like patrol group leader, and people who were not deciding about anything of substance. It was just a logistical function. Anyways, so the accusation was ridiculous, and I knew perfectly well that the data we had was reliable because we had to verify every single allegations from 3 different sources, from a medical source, from an official source, and from the victim or a family source, right? And if you missed one of these 3 sources, you would consider the case not confirmed. We would not even count it in our statistics. And I can tell you that there were many cases, because I continued to do that work until I left the organization. There were many cases in the Luhansk regions for which we only had 2 sources, but we missed the 3rd for various reasons. But it didn't mean that these victims did not exist. They did exist.
Right.
But because that process was so rigorous, we ended up even eliminating victims on the statistics. Who were, in my view, perfectly legitimate victims. So that was the only time when we published statistics. And then, because the Ukrainian government protested, our head of mission, who was a Turkish ambassador, decided, okay, from now on, we will no longer publish statistics about that show, actually, the regional, how can I call that? Regional composition, the display of the victims of the conflict. We'll just announce global figures for the whole of Donbas.
For both sides.
This is what, for both sides mixed together, right?
Yeah.
So you would just announce a global figure. And then the mission, if the global figure was going down or going up, the mission would say, oh, it's a good thing the figure went down, or it's a bad thing the figure went up, right? But our mission refused to go deeper into the details so that people can understand who's actually responsible for most of these victims. So by refusing to state that eminently important fact, we were actually complicit in lying by omission to the entire world. We lied to the Ukrainian people by omission. And they were the first people who were entitled to know the truth, because then how can they vote accordingly for the right people, the right parties, if they don't know what's going on the ground? And even not only they do not know, but according to their own political parties and papers, they were convinced that all the victims were caused by the separatists and the Russian side.
Yes.
This is what the tale that was told them every single day.
Yeah, and that's what we were told.
And we had
here
the means to counter the propaganda, and we didn't actually use these means. We betrayed our mandate, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why I wrote my book.
Got it. So this leads me to my next question. You mentioned earlier that the Minsk peace process was effectively stalled in the absence of new Ukrainian elections for a new government. That happens in 2019. Zelenskyy wins the presidency on a mandate that centers making peace in the Donbas, ending the war there. What happens next?
It's true. First of all, I would say that I remember watching the inauguration speech from Zelenskyy, with translation, but I could see his body language at the same time, and he seemed sincere to me. But okay, you have to think he's an actor as well, right? But at that moment, I was willing to believe him, and I was thinking maybe what regular politician couldn't do, an actor maybe could do. Who knows? Right? So I wanted to believe that he could actually change something. But then, as I mentioned before, I perfectly knew that he also needed the right majority in parliament. So he also knew that, and he actually, one of the first decisions he made was to dissolve the parliament, to have elections as soon as possible, so that he could have a majority that would support him, right? So he was inaugurated in May 2014, and then there were elections organized in July 2019. But the thing is, very quickly, just a few days after his inauguration, there were some signs that occurred that he would not have the freedom to do whatever he wanted to do, even if he was sincere, which I'm not sure of today, right? But if there was sincerity in him about solving the conflict, he could not ignore the fact that the right-wing leaders were warned him. And actually, one of them was Dmitry Yarosh. Yarosh was the founder of the right sector, this far-right movement, violent far-right movement. So he basically, in an interview in the press, basically warned Zelenskyy that if he ever applied the Minsk agreement, he would end up being hanged in the middle of Kyiv, right? So he wouldn't say like who would do it, so he couldn't say that this is direct death threat from him, but he said this is what would happen. And I remember talking to a French diplomat at that time, and he agreed with the idea that if actually Zelenskyy applied the Minsk agreement, he would end up like Isaac Rabin, in Israel. Because if you sign a deal with the enemy, you could likely be killed by the extremists from your own side, right? Which is what happened to Isaac Rabin. So basically, he would follow the fate of Isaac Rabin. That was the statement, I remember. And I also believe in that. So I knew it was not easy, but okay, I was still hoping something could happen. And then there was this memo that was published, which I remember reading at the time. Mike Pence, whom you probably know, and he was interviewed by Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson not so long ago, a few months ago. And it is during his interview with Joe Rogan, they actually mentioned what he called the Red Lines memo. I don't know if you heard about that. But
well, yes,
Red
and
Lines,
actually, yeah. So this is a document released by a number of Ukrainian non-governmental organizations, basically saying that Zelenskyy would be a traitor if he implements the Minsk Accords. And Ivan Kachanovsky, the Ukrainian-Canadian scholar, he points out that the majority of groups that signed that document were funded by the U.S. government.
Yeah, actually, I mentioned this in my book because when I heard Mike Pence talk about it, actually it rang a bell. So, I remember reading about this. But at that time, I actually did not take it seriously because, okay, I thought it was just an NGO that had published that. Okay, it's a far-right NGO. But actually, Mike Pence said, no, look who's behind. Well, first, it's actually a collective of 70 different NGOs. But actually, when you look at their funding, and actually double-checked afterwards, as far as I recall, it was something like the Ukrainian Media Center. I'm paraphrasing the name of this NGO that published this memo. Ukrainian Media Center, or Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. And then you look at who's funding them. You have State Department, you have NATO, you have USAID. Well, all the regular branches of the deep state, you could say, right? So, okay, and as Mike Ben says, basically the red line memo was like the US deep state dictating to Zelenskyy the red lines of the US deep state, of the US administration that he could not cross. And it was not only about the Minsk agreement, actually, when you read the whole thing. The Minsk agreement was part of it, but there was also a whole bunch of laws that were passed by Poroshenko, including language laws. And it was clearly stated that Zelenskyy could not actually go back on any single law passed by Poroshenko. You know, it was like you cannot untouch anything that was done under the Poroshenko administration. Unless it's approved by the Western supports of Ukraine. I'm paraphrasing, but who's the Western supports of Ukraine? Well, primarily the U.S. administration of the U.S. deep state. So it's very clear, when you read it again as like an ultimatum to Zelenskyy. You cannot do what you want without us. And it concludes with the statement that if he fails to follow this warning, that there may be turmoil in the country. And by turmoil, you understand, we could organize another Maidan, and this time you would be the victim, right? So, unfortunately, I think from the start, Zelenskyy had his hands tied. And even though afterwards he got a majority in parliament, his own party, Servant of the People, got more than 50% of the seats in parliament. And then with the so-called pro-Russian party that was in favor of the Minsk agreement, the opposition party was led by Medvedchuk at that time.
Yeah.
And both parties together could actually meet the two-thirds majority required to change the constitution. So they had, just these two parties alone, the capacity to actually implement the Minsk agreement and to solve it once and for all. But there was never a vote. And then what happened? Basically, at some point, there was a meeting at the Normandy level. You know, Normandy format was that format between the French president, the German chancellor, the Russian president, and Ukrainian president. It was a format that was like the godfathers of the Minsk agreements, so to speak. And they gathered in December 2014 at the level of the heads of state and government.
December 2019 in Paris, yes.
2019. Yeah. December 2019. The 5th of December, if I recall correctly. Yeah, 2019, of course. And, oops, my lamp again. And what they actually said, what Zelenskyy said during that, after these talks, he basically came up with this absurd argument, which was already the argument that Poroshenko put forward towards the end of his term. And the argument was that the chronology of events as planned within the Minsk agreement should be changed. And what did they mean by that? The last step of the political measures that were supposed to be taken during the Minsk agreement was for Ukraine to get control of the border with Russia. Right? And why was it the last step in the plan? Because if you were in the shoes of a separatist, you could understand that basically the lifeline was Russia, right? It's clear for everybody. Not only because it was like from Russia that they got like humanitarian aid, most of it, but also most probably ammunitions and maybe military advisors, whatever. It was never officially recognized, but you could obviously guess that without control of the border, they would be lost. Right. So anyways, it was already agreed that once the separatists would get secured with a status, secured with the idea of having their own police, having their own language rights, having their own autonomous government, that from then they would agree to hand the key of the border to the Ukrainian state.
Yes, just to summarize, this was the rebels' leverage to ensure that their autonomous rights, as enshrined under Minsk, could be respected. That once you give us our autonomy, then Russia will withdraw and Ukraine will have control over its border once again. This was basically the last leverage that they had in the aftermath of the Maidan coup, in which their government was overthrown. So this was their way of saying, if you want Russia to pull out and Ukraine to have control of its border again, you have to give us our autonomous rights to ensure that we're going to be secure inside a unified Ukraine.
Yeah, you could also sum things up like that. Now, there was another important aspect, amnesty. There was an amnesty planned in the Minsk agreement. And obviously, as long as the amnesty law was not voted, all these people who were part of the separatist authorities or armed forces, they were afraid to be arrested, right? So before they would actually agree to have Ukrainian state lock the key of the border, they would have guarantees that they will not be arrested, right? That's logic, right? If you put themselves in their shoes, sorry. And so it was perfectly logical that the last step would be the control of the border. Because all the different laws were for Ukraine to adopt. The separatists had no power except the control of the border. But then Poroshenko first, and then Zelenskyy said, we think the measures in the Minsk agreement should be changed. We should change the order, and we should have control of the border first. And what was a guarantee that the separatists would never agree. Because if you get control of the border, and I'm convinced myself, Ukraine would have never applied the Minsk agreement. And one of the tangible signs about that is the Ukrainian parliament voted what they called it was another law called the Law for Reintegration of Donbas. It was the first draft was published at the end of 2017. And in that first draft, there was even an article that specified that the Ukrainian government would actually sue everyone who collaborated with the so-called occupation authorities. And the way it was worded, you could assume that they could even allow themselves to arrest cleaning ladies in kindergarten because they were paid by the separatist authorities. So that's a form of collaboration with the occupation authorities, right? So they could arrest tens of thousands of people if they wanted to with this article. So that mere article created a big turmoil within the national community, within the UN, even within the OSCE, because when we got the text translated, I had one American colleague of mine, I remember, who was working on this with me, and we could not believe that this was written, but it was. And but after tremendous pressure from the Western powers, eventually the Ukrainian authorities withdrew that article. But as it was confirmed to me by one member of parliament afterwards, okay, the article was withdrawn, but it was not replaced by any article mentioning an amnesty, which meant that the authorities would reserve themselves the right to do whatever they wanted, to arrest people if they wanted to. Nothing would prevent them from doing so. So if you are a separatist, you know that the intent of the Ukrainian authorities is to arrest every single one of them. You know that from the end of 2017. How can you trust them, the Ukrainian government, could they trust the Ukrainian government to basically grant them this amnesty in case they got control of the border first of all? It was a non-starter, right? It was, for me, a pretext. When they came up with this reasoning, it was for me an obvious pretext that they would never implement the Minsk agreement. And when I heard Zelenskyy repeat the same argument as Poroshenko, I again told myself, okay, the Minsk agreement is dead once and for all, even with Zelenskyy, even with majority. And that was December 2019.
Yes, and what's happening during that time in the US in December 2019, that's when Democrats are impeaching Trump after he pauses some weapons to Ukraine. And that's when people like Adam Schiff are getting up in Congress and saying that the United States aids Ukraine so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
And that cements this consensus inside the US that the proxy war in Ukraine should go on. And that sends a message to Zelenskyy that he has no US backing for the Minsk Accords and to make peace. So you had a convergence of the pro-war forces in the US and Ukraine that further undermines Minsk. And what does Zelenskyy do when Joe Biden returns to power in 2021? I mean, you had mentioned that there was the numbers there between Zelensky's party and Medvedchuk, the opposition's party, to pass a new law that could advance the Minsk Accords. What does Zelenskyy do? He basically bans Medvedchuk's party because he takes their TV networks off the air. He orders charges against Medvedchuk, and that then leads to a year later, Russia invading. We have limited time, so I want to ask you about just the period right before Russia invades. There were numbers from your organization, from the OSCE, showing that the shelling of the rebel areas by the Ukrainian government in the days before Russia invaded massively increased. So the Ukrainian government was just right before Russia invaded Ukraine, February 2022. The Ukrainian government massively increased its shelling of the Donbas, according to the figures that I saw from your group, the OSCE. Is that what you observed on the ground? And talk to us about what's going on during that period.
If you allow just one sentence about what happened after Joe Biden was inaugurated. Inaugurated in 20th of January 2021, right?
Yeah.
And what you mentioned, like the opposition TV channels banned from the air, was 2nd of February, just like 10 days afterwards, or 10 or 12 days afterwards, almost immediately afterwards. And then when you look at everything that happened during 2021, you have a radicalization of the Ukrainian government under Zelenskyy, acceleration of the radicalization, you could say, and it's done with the backing of the US administration at that time. And when you look at events, which I mention in detail in my book, it's as if they may have sat together and said, oh, what are the things we could do to antagonize the Russian as much as possible, so that they would have no other choice but to attack. It's as if they had made this list and they decided to follow that list and to tick every item one by one until February 2022. When you look at things with hindsight, it's really the impression that you have. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, going back to the statistics. Indeed, again, what many observers reported, including on X and things like that, was that the OSCE indeed could confirm that there was a huge increase of ceasefire violations from 16th of February 2022. So that is to say 8 days before the Russian major operation starts, right? But when you look at the statistics, they do not really show who's responsible for this increase of ceasefire violations. You need to go very much into details to understand the dynamics behind. And the thing is, unfortunately, very few people were able to do that, because the analysis of the detailed information that OSCE published in those days requires first a precise knowledge of all the positions of the OSCE cameras along the front line. And I knew where most of them were, exactly where they were. And I knew the type of images you could get from these cameras. And then I also perfectly knew, because we knew that perfectly, the different positions of both sides. So based on the position of the camera and the description of the shelling at night, because I know at night, the shells have flares so that people can aim easier, right? So the cameras would describe between this time and this time, you have X amount of shells going from west to east. When you know the position of a camera, you know that west to east means from Ukrainian lines to separatist lines. And you have this kind of description repeated day after day. Every time you have data about the night cameras, you have a similar trend being described. And then you can conclude that what was happening, at least in those areas where we had these night cameras, it was the Ukrainian side doing most of the shelling, right? And I also had internal sources from people in the Luhansk team that actually there was a provocation organized by the Ukrainian side in the area of Popasna. Popasna is a small city which is at the close to the limit with the Donetsk Oblast. And it was actually, I wouldn't say occupied, it was controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. And so this is where most of the explosions started to occur when we had this increase of ceasefire violations. And two different sources, including one guy who was rather senior in the organization, told me that this started by a Ukrainian provocation. So in the end, the impression that we had, and this was not clear to me from the start again, I had to go deep into the statistics and then talking to my colleagues, some of them much later on. It was as if the Ukrainian armed forces wanted to provoke Russia to invade. Because they probably knew from the US sources, because the US had announced, if you remember, that Russia would attack on the 16th of February. They had even announced a date. And I always thought it was a bit strange. Why would they announce a date, and why would Russia attack exactly on the date that the Americans mentioned? It didn't seem absurd to me. But this is then the very date when you have this huge increase of ceasefire violations. And so it's as if, again, the Ukrainian forces wanted to provoke Russia to intervene.
Yeah, and the fact that the Biden administration refused to negotiate Russia's core demands, including NATO expansion into Ukraine, and there's also this episode where Biden initially tells Putin that he's willing to rule out the placement of offensive missiles in Ukraine, but then the Antony Blinken walks that back. That's according to the Russian side, at least. Sergei Lavrov has alleged that. So all that leads to a picture where it seems like there was an attempt by the U.S. to provoke Russia into invading. But let's talk about Russia's actions for a second. We've been very critical of the Ukrainian side of the U.S. narrative. I'm curious your thoughts on Russia's actions, starting with Putin. So right before he launches the invasion, he gives a speech. He accuses Ukraine of genocide in the Donbas. Do you think that is an accurate allegation from Putin, that Ukraine was committing genocide against the people of Donbas?
No, actually, when I heard that statement, no, I don't agree with the use of the word of genocide for what happened back then. And the genocide is a systematic killing of an entire people, or measures that would demonstrate a will to eliminate an entire people. I mean, there were war crimes committed, because when you shell civilian population, it's a war crime. Multiple war crimes committed, but I wouldn't go as far as calling that a genocide, because I can't say that it was like something done systematically with the aim of like eradicating a people. But actually, some individuals could actually think in such terms that, oh, we should get rid of the population of Donbas. We should get the territory, we should get the territory back and get rid of the people. Some people think like that. Some of the nationalists, they think like that. But it doesn't mean the government necessarily thought so. So from the start, I had an issue with the use of the term genocide. I did not agree with it. But actually, when I thought a bit deeper about this, what I could come up with would be something different. I would say that what was going on in Ukraine before even the Russian military operation was comparable to a cultural genocide. Because what was going on, the entire Russian language laws that were adopted before under Poroshenko, and they were supposed to actually be implemented in the following years. And this was part of a red line memo again that I mentioned earlier. So in the red line memo, it said
from the
that
US-backed NGOs.
Yeah, from US-backed NGOs. Yeah. It was said that Zelenskyy could not actually change the language laws adopted by Poroshenko. And these language laws, if we follow the logic, will eventually end up with the eradication of the Russian language from Ukraine. Not and beyond the language, it's the entire culture. So for me, it was like there was a cultural genocide in process, right? And I know many Ukrainian people who were shocked by it because they were lovers of Russian literature, for instance. And some of them were heavily shocked by the fact that you could not find books of Russian literature anymore in Ukraine. It hurt them. It hurt their soul because they were raised and educated with that. And it was when I was in Odessa, because when the operation started, I was in Odessa at that moment, talking to a mother who told me that her son actually got his literature teacher breaking the law because she actually read to her class poems, just poems, how dangerous poems can be, right? She read poems from Pushkin, in the original language, which is Russian, which she was not allowed to do. She was only allowed to present these poems in a Ukrainian translation. And I thought, but wait a minute, this is Odessa, a city created by Russians, where everybody speaks Russian, and
Yes.
you cannot teach, a Russian poet who spent a part of his life in Odessa to an audience of Russian-speaking teenagers. This doesn't make any sense. It did not make any sense to me, And for me, it was an insult to common sense and insult to intelligence. And that was the moment that I became aware that what was going on was really wrong. This is worthy of a dictatorship when you end up implementing such extreme measures. And we are talking about 2021 here. I'm not talking about things that happened after the Russian invasion.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was a movement already launched of eradication of the Russian culture. And actually, I found out afterwards that it just went worse once the Russians launched the operations. And they started systematically to basically dismantle all statues of Pushkin throughout Ukraine.
Right.
And to eradicate every trace of Russian culture.
Right. And in terms of Putin's decision to invade, even if one, agrees that Russia was provoked, that Ukraine with US backing was refusing to implement the Minsk Accords, was stepping up its assaults on the Donbas. Do you think that, Putin could have made a better decision than invading a country? Because ultimately, one could argue that he gave the US what it wanted. He got bogged down in a war that's cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Do you think that he could have gone in a different direction, and if he had to intervene militarily for the people of the Donbas, if there was no other choice, could he have just concentrated on the Donbas rather than wider parts of Ukraine?
That's a good question. Probably a question we may never know the answer of with certainty. But it's always difficult to go back on past events and say, what if? We can only speculate. But I remember back in February 22, myself, I understood on 7th of February 2022, the logic behind the Russian moves before it happened. On that day, actually, Macron had met with Putin in a kind of a last desperate effort to change his mind. And after the encounter, there was a press conference, which I watched live, I remember. During the press conference, Putin answered to the question of one French journalist. And the question was kind of provocative, was like, the question is not whether you're going to invade Ukraine, but when. And Putin then answers very quietly, but he says, well, Ukraine and us, we have a fundamental disagreement about Crimea, for instance. We believe Crimea is Russia, but Ukraine thinks otherwise. Now, what happens if Ukraine wants to take Crimea back by military means? And Zelenskyy had signed a decree in March 2001 that allowed it to happen, right?
Yeah.
So that was part of the measures Ukraine took to provoke Russia. So then, 1 year afterwards, 11 months afterwards, Putin mentions, what if Ukraine wants to take Crimea by the power of arms? Well, if at that moment Ukraine is part of NATO, automatically it will mean that NATO would be directly at war with us. And he said, is it what you want? Ask your readers, your audience, is it that they want that the whole of NATO be at war with Russia? Because this is what would happen. Is that what you want? And then I understood at that moment, and it even scared me. I understood that from that perspective, not only Russia should attack before Ukraine would join NATO, but because you could also suspect that Ukraine was just reinforcing itself with US and Western backing day by day, and which we now know is true because even Anthony Blinken admitted that as part of the strategic agreement signed in September and November 2021 with Ukraine, a part of it was mentioned actually the delivery of weapons, but that was a secret clause, right? As he said, because we knew Russia would want to invade. but actually you could say that because they knew they were doing everything for Russia to invade, right? Anyways, so from the Russian perspective, they had their interest was then to attack the sooner the better, because if they were waiting until Ukraine would be part of NATO, it would be like too late. It would mean that they would have to fight the entire organization. And Putin said in previous interviews that that would be madness. So I understood from his perspective that he had no other choice than doing that. And when you think like that, that's scary, because the logic was, to me, inescapable. And even now, if you ask me, could it have done otherwise? I'm not sure what he could have done otherwise, because, as you mentioned, the Biden administration had rejected any request to negotiate a global security agreement that could ensure that Ukraine would never join NATO, and which was known since the early 90s, since Samuel Huntington, when he wrote The Class of Civilization, published in 1996. It was known that if Ukraine tried to join NATO, that could likely create a civil war within Ukraine, and then it would end up with Russia intervening and ending up with a partition of the country. This is
And that's exactly what William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush, warned about in his now famous memo, "Niet means niet." And after Russia invades, what happens? You immediately have talks between Ukraine and Russia. They begin in Belarus, and that culminates in the reaching of a draft agreement, or the outlines of a draft agreement, in Istanbul. And now we know from multiple sources, Ukrainian, Western, and others, that the U.S. and UK told Ukraine, if you reach a peace deal with Russia, we're not going to back you up, and we won't give you the security guarantees you need to finalize that deal. And that's after that you have the war that continues today. Closing now on the summit we just had with Putin and Trump in Alaska. Not much concrete has come out of this, except for Trump saying he's no longer saying there needs to be a ceasefire. Now he's saying there needs to be a comprehensive peace agreement, and it's on Ukraine, it's on Zelenskyy to accept it. So what are your thoughts on the Alaska summit and the Ukraine-Russia conflict going forward?
Well, I think it's a good thing, first of all, that it happened. Second, I think it's also a good thing that now we are not talking about ceasefire agreement, because the Russians have always been clear they will never accept a Minsk 3, because a new ceasefire agreement would be exactly that, a Minsk 3. And we know that the Minsk agreements failed, primarily because of Ukraine and the West. The West failed in pushing Ukraine to implement its part of the agreement. So, and even it was even admitted by both Hollande, the former French president, and Angela Merkel, former German chancellor, both said in interviews that the Minsk agreement were meant to gain time for Ukraine to gain time for what? For rearming, basically, and eventually trying to solve things out militarily. So it was a betrayal of the West betrayed its word, especially the Europeans. So Putin said he would never accept the Minsk III agreement. So now it's a good thing that we'll talk about a permanent peace agreement, because this is what the Russians asked for. And this is and they said, they were very clear that this is the only thing they would accept. They always kept insisting on dealing with the root causes of the conflict. And the root causes of the conflict, and we go back to the speech by Putin from February 2022, just when launching the operation, they wanted basically a neutralization of Ukraine, right? Number one. Demilitarization, denazification, neutralization, non-Ukrainian NATO, right? And then there was also the issue of Crimea being Russian, and at that time they wanted the Donbas republics to be recognized as independent, because there was no claim for them to be Russian at that moment. Now, down the line, after the failure of the talks in Istanbul that you reminded us of, the Russians basically raised their demands higher, and they decided to basically make Ukraine and the West pay a higher price for peace. Because they said, you didn't want peace back in March 2022. Okay, now the price will be higher, because we'll take reality of the ground that we control, right? We take account of the reality on the ground. And as time goes on, it was kind of pressure on the West. The more time passes on, the more Russia gets territory. So the harder the price for Ukraine to pay it will be. And some people like Arestovich has perfectly understood that. Unfortunately,
He's a former
no
advisor
longer,
to Zelensky.
yeah, former advisor of Zelensky who would like to run as president, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem like he's like has the ear of anybody important now in the West. But he still has millions of followers, this guy, and he perfectly explained that the longer Ukraine waits, the higher the price it will have to pay for peace. Anyways, this is the card that Russia decided to play, and they have the upper hand militarily right now. I mean, now the West has understood, I think, that there is no way by military means that Ukraine gets control of Donbas back, let alone Crimea. Nobody believes in that anymore, apart from some crazy fanatics. So from that point of view, what is the point of, making this conflict lasting any longer? It doesn't make any sense, even from the Ukrainian perspective. If you're a realist, you should sign for peace now and not wait any longer. And so now the ball is on Zelensky's side. The problem is, knowing the nationalist Ukrainians, I don't believe that they are able to accept any kind of compromise. And I can refer you to an article written by Henry Kissinger on 5th of March 2014 in the Washington Post. In this article, he mentioned that one of the main problems that Ukrainians had was that they were like, they had a lot of difficulties to accept compromises. I'm paraphrasing, but this is what he says. And this is what also I could confirm from my experience on the ground. Just after a few weeks being in Donbas, at some time we were stopped at a military checkpoint. And one of the soldiers of one of his volunteer battalion, I think it was Dnipro 1 soldier at that time, he decided to make a statement to us. And he said, well, basically Poroshenko, who was then the Ukrainian president, should not negotiate anything. We should just kill the enemy and that's it. This is how these people think, right? For them, negotiation is betrayal. There's no such thing as negotiation. Because if you start to negotiate, it means you're going to do some compromise. And the smallest form of compromise is already betrayal for them. You're not even allowed to talk in Ukraine about peace negotiations. Some people got sued for daring, in recent years now, for daring to publicly call for negotiations. They were sued for betrayal, high treason. So this is insanity has taken over these people. So insanity is ruling Ukraine and is ruling most of the Western world, especially Europe by now, unfortunately. When you look at all the statements of the European leaders today, they all align on the idea that no compromise should be reached against Ukraine. So they are against any limitation of Ukraine joining NATO. They are against any limitation of the Ukrainian armed forces. They are against any change of the border without the approval of Ukraine. They say you cannot change international borders by force. But this is exactly what NATO did in Kosovo, by the way. We changed the borders of a country called Serbia by creating a mafia state of Kosovo. NATO did it. But what is it if not a change of border by violent means? Okay, but it's okay in Kosovo, but it's not okay in Ukraine. Anyway, so the Western leaders, mostly Europeans, also influencing Zelenskyy, obviously. So unfortunately, I'm not optimistic about Zelenskyy, his entourage, or the European governments accepting any security deal that Russia would deem acceptable for itself. So I don't know. I'm afraid we're going to have to wait for many more people to die on the battlefield. For what? For Ukraine to lose more in the end. So it's so obvious to me and so absurd at the same time, but the incapacity of people to accept reality on the ground, this ideological approach of things, is a tragedy. I really think. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I hope a miracle occurs and that European leaders all of a sudden realize that there's no point in continuing this war, and that it only end up with a weakened Ukraine and a weakened West as a whole. I hope they will realize that, but We haven't shown in the recent past that they were reasonable people, so we'll see.
Well, it's really important that we have somebody from the inside, somebody from a Western perspective on the ground in Ukraine, speaking out and essentially shattering through the propaganda that we've been told about this war. And that's what you've done, Benoit Paré, with your new book, What I Saw in Ukraine, 2015 to 2022, Diary of an International Observer. I will link to the book in the show notes for this interview. Benoit Paré, thank you so much for joining me on the Grayzone.
Thank you very much.